Isaac Weller stood at his cabin door watching the blizzard erase the world beyond 20 feet, knowing his firewood supply sat in the shed 30 yards away. Most prospectors would have died making that journey, but Isaac simply walked down his stairs and disappeared beneath the snow. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if frontier survival stories like this one speak to you, subscribe because tomorrow's tale is even more extraordinary. The winter of 1853 brought Isaac Weller to the Montana Territory goldfields with nothing but practical sense and 7 years of prospecting experience. He had worked claims in California and Colorado, learned to read terrain for color, and understood that survival in the mountains required careful planning more than bravery. The gold camps scattered through the Montana wilderness attracted men willing to risk everything for wealth, but the mountains extracted payment in ways that had nothing to do with mining, accidents, or claim disputes. Blizzards killed prospectors with efficient regularity. The storms arrived suddenly, dropping temperatures 40 degrees in an hour and creating whiteout conditions that turned familiar ground into featureless emptiness. Men froze to death 10 feet from their cabin doors, disoriented and unable to find shelter they could have touched if they had simply walked straight. The problem was never distance. The problem was that when the wind screamed and snow filled the air like a white wall, all sense of direction vanished within seconds. Isaac understood this danger because he paid attention to how men died. During his first winter in Montana, he heard stories from survivors and found bodies when spring came. A prospector named William Chen had frozen 15 feet from his door with his arms stretched forward, still reaching for the cabin he never found. Another man, whose name no one remembered, had walked in circles around his own structure for hours, his tracks forming confused spirals in the snow until he collapsed from exhaustion. The common factor in these deaths was always the same. They had left shelter to retrieve firewood from external storage. Every prospector faced the same dilemma. Firewood could not be stored inside cabins. The space was too small, and the quantity needed for a Montana winter was massive. A man required approximately half a cord of wood per month to maintain survivable interior temperatures. That meant 3 to 4 cords for a winter season, roughly 450 cubic feet of stacked logs. No cabin had room for that volume while still maintaining living space. The solution was always external storage: woodsheds, covered stacks, or simple piles protected by canvas. The fuel sat outside, 20 or 30 or 50 yards from the cabin door, and when the fire burned low, someone had to go get more. Isaac had partnered that season with Daniel Pierce, a former furniture maker from Ohio who had come west after his wife died. They established a claim along a creek that showed decent color and built a standard cabin using techniques both men knew from previous mining camps. The structure was solid, well chinked, with a good fireplace and a door that sealed properly. Their woodshed sat 30 yards away, positioned where fallen trees were abundant and hauling was convenient. They rigged a rope between cabin and shed, thinking it would provide guidance during storms. Most prospectors used similar systems. The ropes almost never worked. February 18, 1854, arrived with deceptive calm. The morning had been clear and cold, the kind of crystalline winter day that made the mountains beautiful instead of threatening. Isaac and Daniel spent the morning working their sluice boxes, breaking ice from the creek and processing gravel that showed modest gold content. By afternoon, clouds had moved in from the northwest, but neither man felt concerned. Weather changed, constantly in the mountains. The wind arrived an hour later. What had been gentle snowfall transformed into a blizzard with startling speed. Wind gusts shook the cabin walls, and snow began falling so heavily that the woodshed vanished from view. The temperature inside dropped as wind found every gap in the chinking. Daniel looked at the fireplace and noted their interior wood supply was running low. They kept perhaps a dozen logs inside for immediate use, enough for a few hours of fire. The main supply sat in the shed outside. Daniel stood and pulled on his heavy coat. Isaac asked if it could wait until the storm passed. Daniel shook his head and said the fire would be out in 2 hours without fuel, and they would be dangerously cold by morning if they let the cabin temperature drop. He was right. They had discussed this situation before and agreed that keeping the fire going was essential. Daniel wrapped a scarf around his face, lit a lantern, and opened the door. The wind nearly tore the door from his hands. Snow blasted into the cabin in a horizontal sheet. Daniel leaned into the storm and pulled the door shut behind him. Isaac returned to his book but found himself unable to concentrate. He fed 2 more logs into the fire and listened to the wind howl. The rope system they had installed would guide Daniel to the woodshed and back, 30 yards out, load up with logs, 30 yards return. 5 minutes total, perhaps 10 in heavy wind. 20 minutes passed. Isaac stood and looked out the window but saw only white chaos. 30 minutes. He began pulling on his winter gear. 45 minutes. Isaac opened the door and stepped into conditions that made breathing difficult. The wind drove snow into his face with physical force. He grabbed the rope and began pulling himself along it, moving hand over hand toward where the woodshed should be. 15 feet from the cabin, the rope went slack in his hands. The end swung free, frayed where wind and ice had worked it, against a sharp log edge. Isaac retreated to the cabin and gathered a longer rope, a spare lantern, and his rifle to use as a walking staff. He went back into the storm and began a methodical search pattern, moving in carefully measured circles. The search took 3 hours. He found Daniel 12 feet from the woodshed entrance, lying face down in the snow with his arms outstretched. Daniel had reached the shed, loaded his arms with firewood, and started back. Somewhere in the whiteout, he had become disoriented and expended his body heat in confusion until hypothermia took him. Isaac dragged Daniel's body back to the cabin. He spent that night sitting beside his dead partner, feeding logs into the fire. Daniel Pierce had frozen to death 30 yards from shelter while trying to accomplish the most basic survival task. Isaac buried Daniel on a hillside above their claim when the ground thawed enough to dig. He marked the grave with stones and spent 3 days settling Daniel's affairs, cataloging his possessions, and writing a letter to Daniel's brother in Ohio. The work gave Isaac's hands something to do while his mind circled endlessly around the same question. How could a man die traveling 60 yards total in conditions that lasted only a few hours? He began visiting other prospecting camps within a day's travel of his claim. Isaac told people he was looking for a new partner, but what he actually did was study how men stored their firewood and what systems they used to access it during storms. Every camp had a different approach. Some kept ropes strung between cabin and woodpile. Others had installed bells on poles that they could ring to provide auditory guidance. A few had built covered walkways using canvas stretched over wooden frames. One prospector had planted a line of poles every 6 feet between his door and his wood supply, creating physical landmarks he could move between even in whiteout conditions. None of these systems worked reliably. Isaac found a camp where the rope system had failed exactly as his had, the line abraded through by ice and wind. He found another where the bell had blown down during a January storm. The covered walkway approach looked promising until Isaac examined the structures closely and realized that wind strong enough to create whiteout conditions was also strong enough to tear canvas from frames. The pole system was the most robust, but even it had limitations. A man could miss a pole by 3 feet in heavy snow and wander off course. The pattern became clear through these visits. Men did not die because they were careless or stupid or unprepared. They died because the problem itself was unsolvable using conventional approaches. A blizzard eliminated all normal methods of navigation. Visual landmarks disappeared. Sound became unreliable as wind distorted everything. Physical guidelines like ropes worked only until they broke. The fundamental issue was exposure to the weather. Every solution prospectors tried still required a man to go outside into conditions that could kill him. Isaac spent evening hours in his cabin, sketching diagrams and making notes. He drew maps of typical camp layouts showing cabins and woodsheds and the death zones between them. He calculated how long a man could survive in different wind and temperature combinations. He listed every navigation method he had seen or heard about and then listed how each one failed. By late April of 1854, Isaac understood that he was trying to solve the wrong problem. The question was not how to navigate safely through a blizzard. The question was how to avoid going through the blizzard at all. He thought about mine shafts and how miners worked underground regardless of surface weather. He remembered root cellars from his childhood in Pennsylvania. He recalled seeing prairie dog colonies with tunnel systems connecting multiple burrows. The concept was simple. If you could not safely travel over the ground, travel under it. Spring of 1854 brought Isaac back to his claim with a mind focused entirely on one problem. He needed to understand if a tunnel connecting his cabin to external wood storage was actually feasible or simply a grief-inspired fantasy. The concept seemed logical, but Isaac had no engineering training and limited construction experience beyond basic carpentry. He would need to learn principles he had never studied. He started by observing mine shafts in the area. Gold prospectors dug into hillsides following ore veins, and their tunnels stayed open for months or years without collapsing. Isaac spent 3 days at a larger mining operation 10 miles from his claim, watching experienced miners work and asking questions about tunnel construction. The miners explained that soft earth required timber reinforcement to prevent cave-ins. They showed him how they installed support posts and cross beams at regular intervals, creating a framework that held back the surrounding soil. The technique was called shoring, and it was essential for any tunnel that went more than a few feet into the ground. Isaac asked about water problems. The miners told him that any tunnel below the water table would flood unless constantly pumped, but shallow tunnels above the water table generally stayed dry if they were sloped properly for drainage. Water always flowed downhill. A tunnel with even a slight grade would shed any moisture that seeped in. Isaac made careful notes and sketched diagrams of the shoring patterns he observed. He rode to a homestead 40 miles east where a family from Germany had built an elaborate root cellar system. The structure extended 12 feet underground with stone walls and a timber roof, maintaining stable, cool temperatures year-round for food storage. The farmer showed Isaac how the entrance was built with a wooden frame and stairs descending into the earth. The ceiling used thick beams covered with planks and then buried under 4 feet of soil. The farmer explained that the earth itself provided insulation. Underground temperatures remained relatively constant, regardless of surface weather. In summer, the cellar stayed cool. In winter, it stayed warmer than the frozen surface. Isaac asked if the structure ever collapsed. The farmer said it had been there for 8 years without problems because the walls were solid and the roof was properly supported. He emphasized that the key was building strong enough to bear the weight of the earth above. Weak construction would fail. Robust construction would last decades. Back at his claim, Isaac spent a week observing animal burrows in the hillsides. Ground squirrels and marmots created tunnel systems that survived mountain weather year after year. He excavated an abandoned burrow carefully to see its construction. The tunnels descended at angles that prevented water accumulation and were carved through dense clay soil that held its shape without reinforcement. Isaac synthesized what he had learned into a basic theory. A tunnel was feasible if he followed certain principles. It needed to be shallow enough to avoid water problems, but deep enough to be covered by soil and snow for insulation. It required timber reinforcement strong enough to support the earth above. It needed a slight downward slope for drainage. The entrance and exit points needed solid framing to prevent collapse. Summer of 1854 marked the beginning of construction that would consume 3 months of Isaac's life. He began by selecting the location for his new woodshed, measuring exactly 40 feet from his cabin's north wall where the terrain sloped gently downward. The slight grade was intentional. Water would drain away from the cabin naturally if his tunnel followed the land's contour. Isaac spent the first week digging. He started inside his cabin, removing floorboards in the northwest corner and excavating a pit 4 feet deep. From this pit he began, trenching outward, angling slightly downward as he moved away from the cabin foundation. The work was backbreaking. Montana soil was dense clay mixed with rocks, requiring a pickaxe to break through and a shovel to remove. He hauled countless buckets of earth out of the growing trench, dumping them in a pile he would later use to cover the completed tunnel. The trench took 3 weeks to complete. 40 feet long, 4 feet deep at the cabin end, 5 feet deep at the far end where the woodshed would stand. The width was 3 feet at ground level, slightly wider at the bottom to allow for log wall thickness. Isaac shaped the trench bottom to be as smooth and level as possible, removing rocks and filling low spots with graded soil. Log selection came next. Isaac needed straight, uniform timber approximately 8 inches in diameter. He spent another week cutting and hauling logs from a stand of lodgepole pine 2 miles from his claim. He rejected any log with significant taper, excessive knots, or rot. Each log was stripped of bark using a draw knife, then cut to precise lengths. Wall logs were 3 feet long to span the tunnel width. Ceiling logs were 4 feet long to span the full tunnel width, plus overlap the wall logs for support. Construction of the tunnel walls began in late July. Isaac worked from the cabin end outward, stacking logs horizontally along both sides of the trench. The logs sat directly on the trench bottom, and each successive log was placed atop the previous one. He notched the logs at their ends where they would meet ceiling supports, creating interlocking joints that distributed weight. Between each wall log, Isaac packed a mixture of clay and small stones, filling gaps and creating a relatively smooth interior surface. The ceiling was the most critical structural element. Isaac placed support logs across the tunnel width every 3 feet, resting them on the top wall logs. These supports bore the weight of everything above. Across the supports, he laid ceiling logs perpendicular to the tunnel's length, creating a solid roof. The ceiling logs were fitted tightly together, with clay mixture packed between them to seal gaps. As the log structure progressed, Isaac backfilled soil around the outside of the walls, tamping it firmly to provide lateral support. By mid-August, the tunnel structure was complete. It resembled a horizontal log cabin buried in a trench, with solid walls, a robust ceiling, and a floor of hard-packed earth sloping gently for drainage. Other prospectors who visited called it insane effort for a simple problem. The tunnel structure was complete by mid-August, but Isaac knew the system would fail without proper access points at both ends. The connection between his cabin and the tunnel required careful engineering. Inside the cabin's northwest corner, where he had excavated the entry pit, Isaac built a staircase descending 4 feet to the tunnel entrance. The stairs were simple but sturdy, constructed from thick planks notched into 2 side stringers. Each step was wide enough for a boot and deep enough to descend safely while carrying an armload of firewood. At the top of the stairs, Isaac installed a trapdoor in his cabin floor. He built the door from 3 planks joined with cross bracing, making it strong enough to walk on when closed. The door was hinged on one side with leather straps and fitted precisely into the floor opening. When closed, it sat flush with the surrounding floorboards. A simple wooden latch kept it secure. Opening the trapdoor revealed the stairs descending into darkness. The tunnel entrance itself needed reinforcement where it met the open space of the stairwell. Isaac built a frame using 4 vertical posts and a heavy horizontal header beam, creating a rectangular portal, identical in principle to a doorway. The frame supported the earth above the opening and prevented the tunnel's log ceiling from sagging or collapsing where it transitioned from buried structure to open air. He packed additional clay around the frame, sealing any gaps between the logs and the timber posts. At the far end of the tunnel, 40 feet from the cabin, Isaac excavated a vertical shaft rising from the tunnel ceiling to ground level. This shaft was 3 feet square and 5 feet deep, essentially a small room with the tunnel opening at its bottom and the woodshed floor at its top. He lined the shaft walls with vertical planks to prevent soil collapse and built a ladder using wooden rungs pegged into side rails. The ladder allowed him to climb from the tunnel up into the woodshed. The woodshed itself was constructed directly over this exit shaft. Isaac built it using standard methods: vertical corner posts, horizontal wall logs, and a slanted roof covered with split shakes. The structure measured 8 feet square, large enough to store several cords of split firewood. The floor was unique. Instead of solid planking, Isaac left the center open, where the vertical shaft descended. A simple wooden cover, similar to the cabin's trapdoor, could be placed over the opening when not in use. The entire system created a complete circuit. Isaac could open his cabin trapdoor, descend the stairs, walk through the 40-foot tunnel while remaining completely underground, climb the ladder in the exit shaft, and emerge inside the woodshed. He could load his arms with firewood and return through the same route. The journey took approximately 5 minutes. He never stepped outside. He never exposed himself to weather. The surface conditions were irrelevant. Isaac tested the system repeatedly during September while weather remained mild. He walked the tunnel dozens of times, checking for structural weaknesses and identifying rough spots that needed smoothing. He made minor adjustments and verified that the slight downward slope was adequate for drainage. Fall of 1854 arrived with the brilliant colors that marked Montana's brief transition between summer heat and winter cold. Isaac spent September and early October preparing for the season that would test his system. He cut firewood with obsessive dedication, felling trees, bucking them into lengths, and splitting the rounds into pieces sized for his fireplace. By the end of October, he had processed and stacked 4 full cords of wood inside the shed, enough fuel to last until March, even if winter proved severe. He walked the tunnel daily, inspecting the log walls and ceiling for any signs of stress or movement. The structure remained solid. No logs had shifted, no gaps had opened. The clay packing between wall logs stayed intact. The slight downward slope from cabin to woodshed performed exactly as intended. A small amount of moisture that condensed on the cool log surfaces during warm days drained naturally toward the lower end and soaked into the earthen floor. The first snow fell in early November, a light dusting that melted within 2 days. Isaac watched it carefully, noting where accumulation formed and where wind swept the ground clear. The second snow came a week later and stayed. By mid-November, 6 inches of snow covered the ground along the entire route where his tunnel ran beneath. The white blanket concealed the fact that anything existed below. From outside, there was no indication that a passage connected his cabin to the woodshed 30 yards away. Isaac discovered something he had not fully anticipated. The snow provided additional insulation beyond what the earth alone offered. The tunnel temperature, which had been cool but comfortable during autumn, became noticeably warmer as snow accumulated above. The combination of earth and snow created a thermal barrier that kept the tunnel interior significantly warmer than the surface air. When outside temperatures dropped below zero, the tunnel remained above freezing. The cabin's heat radiated slightly through the floorboards and down the entrance stairs, and that warmth was trapped in the insulated space. December brought heavier snowfall. By Christmas, 3 feet of snow covered the ground. Isaac maintained his routine of checking the tunnel weekly, descending through the cabin trapdoor and walking the full length to verify structural integrity. Everything held perfectly. The log walls showed no movement. The ceiling supported the weight of earth and snow without sagging. The tunnel remained dry despite the moisture-heavy snow above. He began using the system for its intended purpose during this period, not out of necessity, but to establish familiarity. Each morning, Isaac descended into the tunnel, walked to the woodshed, and brought back enough firewood for the day. The task became routine. Open trapdoor, descend stairs, walk through darkness, touching the log walls for guidance. Climb ladder, load wood, return. 5 minutes total. He could accomplish the journey without a lantern once he memorized the tunnel's length and the location of the ladder. By January of 1855, Isaac felt confident his system would perform when truly needed. He did not have to wait long for that test to arrive. The storm arrived on January 23, 1855, with the characteristic suddenness of mountain weather. Isaac woke to calm conditions and was eating breakfast when the wind began. Within an hour, the blizzard had transformed the world outside his cabin into a white void. Snow fell so heavily that he could not see the woodshed 30 yards away. Wind gusts shook the cabin walls and created drifts that climbed halfway up his door. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero. Isaac spent the morning reading and maintaining his fire. Around noon, he descended through the trapdoor to retrieve more firewood. The tunnel was dark and quiet, completely isolated from the chaos above. He walked the 40 feet to the exit shaft, climbed the ladder, and pushed open the woodshed trapdoor. Wind howled through gaps in the shed walls, and snow had drifted through cracks, but the interior remained mostly clear. Isaac loaded his arms with split logs, descended back into the tunnel, and returned to his cabin. The entire journey took 5 minutes. His coat remained hanging by the door, unused. The blizzard continued for 4 days. Wind speeds exceeded 50 miles per hour, according to Isaac's estimate, based on the sound and the structural stress on his cabin. Snow accumulated in drifts 6 feet deep in some areas. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet during the worst periods. The temperature never rose above zero. These were conditions that killed men, and Isaac knew from conversations with other prospectors that several camps within 20 miles were likely running dangerously low on firewood. Isaac's routine remained unchanged. He descended into his tunnel 4 or 5 times per day to retrieve fuel. Each trip was identical to the last. The storm raging above made no difference to his ability to access his wood supply. He remained warm, well-fed, and adequately supplied throughout the event. There was no drama in his survival. There was no heroic struggle against nature. There was only a man walking through a log-lined tunnel he had built during the previous summer, accomplishing a simple task that would have been fatal using conventional methods. On the 4th day, the storm broke. Wind subsided and snow stopped falling. The sky cleared to brilliant blue. Isaac opened his cabin door and stepped outside for the first time in days. The landscape had been transformed. Drifts covered his woodshed completely on one side. The tunnel route was buried under 4 to 5 feet of snow, but from the woodshed's roof, a faint wisp of vapor rose into the cold air. Warm air from Isaac's cabin, traveling through the tunnel and up through gaps in the shed structure, created condensation visible in the frigid morning. A prospector named Thomas Webb passed by Isaac's claim later that day, traveling on snowshoes. He stopped and stared at the vapor rising from the woodshed, clearly puzzled. Isaac explained the tunnel system. Webb listened with the expression of a man hearing something that should have been obvious but never occurred to him. He asked if he could see it. Thomas Webb descended into Isaac's tunnel that afternoon and emerged with an understanding that would spread through the Montana prospecting community over the following months. Webb had lost 3 toes to frostbite during the January blizzard after making repeated dangerous trips to his woodpile. He examined Isaac's system with the careful attention of a man who had nearly died from the problem it solved. Webb asked detailed questions. How deep was the tunnel? What kept it from collapsing? How long did construction take? Did water accumulate? Isaac answered each question without embellishment, explaining the principles he had learned from miners and root sellers. Webb took notes using a pencil stub and folded paper. Before leaving, he asked if Isaac minded if others learned about the design. Isaac said he did not mind at all. Survival knowledge should be shared, not hoarded. Spring of 1855 brought confirmation of what Isaac had suspected during the blizzard. 3 prospectors had frozen to death in the surrounding district during that January storm. 2 had died attempting to reach their wood supplies. A 3rd had tried to wait out the storm without adequate fuel and had frozen inside his own cabin when his fire went out. Frank Mercer, a prospector who worked a claim 8 miles east of Isaac's, had survived but lost 2 fingers on his left hand to frostbite after getting disoriented between his cabin and woodshed. Frank visited Isaac in April after the snow melted enough for travel. He was a quiet man in his 40s who had come west from Pennsylvania 5 years earlier. He examined the tunnel entrance in Isaac's cabin and asked to walk through to the woodshed. Isaac led him through the passage. Frank moved slowly, running his hands along the log walls, studying the ceiling construction, noting the drainage slope. At the woodshed end, he climbed the ladder and stood in the structure where Isaac stored his remaining firewood. Frank said he would build one at his own claim before next winter. He asked if Isaac would visit during construction to verify he was doing it correctly. Isaac agreed. In June, he spent 3 days at Frank's claim, watching as Frank excavated his trench and offering suggestions about log selection and wall construction. Frank's tunnel was shorter than Isaac's, only 30 feet, but the principles were identical. By August, Frank had a functional system connecting his cabin to his woodshed. Word spread gradually through the scattered prospecting camps. Not every man who heard about tunnel construction chose to build one. The work was substantial, requiring weeks of hard labor during the brief summer season when digging was possible. Some prospectors considered it excessive preparation for a problem that might only occur a few times each winter. Others lacked the carpentry skills or simply the motivation to undertake such a project. But men who had experienced close calls during blizzards understood the value immediately. By the fall of 1856, 7 tunnel systems existed in the Montana Territory goldfields. By 1858, the number had grown to 15. Prospectors called them Weller tunnels. Isaac Weller sold his Montana claim in the spring of 1858 and moved west to Oregon Territory. Gold production from his creek had declined, and at 43 years old, he wanted a less isolated life. He purchased land in the Willamette Valley and established a small farm, growing wheat and raising cattle. The work was predictable and safe, far removed from the dangers that had defined his prospecting years. His tunnel remained behind, built into the land itself. The new owner of Isaac's claim was a man named Joseph Chen, who recognized the value of the system immediately. Joseph maintained the tunnel and used it through 5 subsequent winters before selling the claim and moving to California. The next owner did the same. The structure Isaac had built in 1854 continued functioning into the 1870s, outlasting the men who used it. The tunnel design spread beyond Montana as prospectors moved to new gold strikes in Idaho and Wyoming. Variations appeared based on local conditions and individual skill. Some tunnels were longer, connecting cabins to multiple outbuildings. Some were shorter, simple passages for firewood access. A few ambitious builders created branching systems with tunnels running to woodsheds, root cellars, and even privies, allowing complete winter operation without surface exposure. The fundamental principle remained constant across all variations. Build a reinforced passage underground and let snow provide additional insulation. Historians who later studied frontier survival techniques estimated the design saved dozens of lives over 2 decades. The exact number was impossible to determine because survival rarely generated records. Men who did not freeze to death simply continued living and working their claims. But accounts from the period included multiple references to prospectors weathering severe storms without incident, specifically because they had built tunnel access to their fuel supplies. The phrase "built like Weller" became common in mining camps, signifying construction that prioritized function and durability over speed. Men who built Weller tunnels were considered practical and forward-thinking. Those who mocked the effort often changed their opinions after experiencing a serious blizzard. Isaac married in 1861 and raised 4 children on his Oregon farm. He rarely spoke about his prospecting years. His family knew he had worked gold claims in Montana, but he never mentioned the tunnel or Daniel Pierce's death. To his children, he was simply a farmer who had come west during the gold rush and been wise enough to leave before the opportunity vanished. He died in 1892 at age 77, surrounded by his family. His obituary in the Portland newspaper mentioned his early years in the Montana goldfields, but included no details about his innovations. He was buried in a cemetery outside Salem. His gravestone recorded his name, dates, and the word farmer. Nothing suggested he had solved one of frontier life's most dangerous problems. In Montana, his original tunnel remained visible into the 1890s, the log walls still solid, the entrance frame weathered but intact. Snow still accumulated above it each winter, and the passage below stayed dry and protected, a silent testament to engineering over endurance.